of Ashbrook was drowning in stillness, the kind that blanketed everything and pressed against the skin. Fenwick, Wick to his parents and the rare friends he managed to charm, sat cross-legged on his bed, surrounded by the quiet chaos of his small room. It was his sanctuary, cluttered with paper animals, perched on the shelves and sketches pinned to the walls. Shadows danced across the room, cast by the soft glow of his bedside lamp, which flickered faintly whenever the wind outside rattled the windows. He folded a piece of paper with meticulous care, the sharp crease forming the wing of a crane. The air was cool against his skin, and a faint hum of late autumn's chill seeped through the poorly sealed window. Wick's attention was rapt, his tongue poking out slightly as he made sure the lines were precise. Paper animals weren't just crafts to him. They were tiny worlds, a refuge from the monotony of everyday life. A bark broke the quiet. Wick froze, startled by the sound. It was the neighbor's dog, an excitable golden retriever named Buddy, who had a habit of barking at anything that moved. Wick glanced at the window, his unease blooming. Normally, Buddy's yaps were a comforting backdrop to Ashbrook's nights, but tonight they felt sharper, cutting through the silence in a way that made his skin prickle. He waited, listening, but the barking stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy quiet in its wake. Then came the tap, a sharp, deliberate sound against the glass. Wick's gaze snapped to the window, his stomach tightened, and for a moment he thought it must be a branch knocking in the wind. But it came again, tap, 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 measured, almost polite. He set the half-finished crane on his bed and slid off, his bare feet meeting the cold wood floor. Wick hesitated, the fine hairs on his arms standing on end. Through the glass, a shadow shifted. His breath fogged the window as he leaned closer, and his heart stuttered at the sight. Perched on the sill was a bird, but not one of flesh and feathers. It was paper, sharp, angular, and impossibly detailed. Its folded wings shimmered faintly in the moonlight, catching every crease like the edge of a blade. Wick didn't move. The bird cocked its head, its movements too smooth, too precise, as though unseen hands guided it. He reached for the latch but stopped short, his fingers trembling. Something primal screamed at him not to open it, but curiosity had always been his master. Slowly, he unlatched the window and pushed it open. The night air spilled into the room, crisp and brimming with the scent of damp leaves. The paper bird didn't hesitate. It hopped inside, landing on the desk with a sound so soft it barely registered. Wick stepped back instinctively, his pulse racing. "Who sent you?" he whispered. His voice felt small, absurd against the weight of the moment. The bird turned its sharp head toward him, its eyeless face seeming to watch. Then it spoke. The sound wasn't a chirp or a caw, but a dry melodic whisper, like pages of an ancient book being turned in the wind. The words weren't in any language Wick knew, yet they slipped into his ears and settled uneasily in his chest. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely audible. The bird repeated the phrase, slower this time, each syllable a delicate blade carving through the silence. Wick's chest tightened, and his knees felt weak. It wasn't just the sound of the words, it was the way they clung to the air, pressing down on him as though the room itself was shrinking. The bird hopped toward a blank piece of paper on his desk, tapping it with its beak. Wick flinched, but didn't move. He watched, transfixed, as the paper began folding itself, its edges creasing with deliberate precision. When the transformation was complete, a strange symbol remained. a swirling pattern of sharp angles and spirals that pulsed faintly, as though alive. "What does it mean?" Wick asked, his voice trembling. The bird responded with a sound that could almost be laughter, brittle and mocking. It tapped the symbol again, and Wick felt an overwhelming pull. The alien words the bird had spoken surged to the forefront of his mind, demanding to be repeated. His lips moved before he could stop them, and the syllables spilled out like an incantation. The room responded instantly. The air grew heavy, thick with an energy that made the hair on Wick's arms stand on end. Shadows twisted along the walls, writhing like living things. The lamp flickered violently before the bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. "Wick!" His mother's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with panic. The door swung open, flooding the room with light from the hallway. Nora's face was pale as her eyes darted from the shattered lamp to her trembling son. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to his side. "There was a bird," Wick whispered, clutching her arm. It talked to me." "A bird?" Nora frowned, scanning the room. "Sweetheart, there's nothing here." It was right there. Wick pointed to the desk, but the paper crow was gone. The strange symbol had vanished too, leaving only scattered scraps of paper. "You had a bad dream," Nora said gently, though her voice wavered. She knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "It's okay, love. Let's clean this up, and you can sleep in our room tonight." "But it wasn't a dream," Wick insisted, his voice trembling. His certainty made Nora pause, her gaze lingering on the broken lamp. "Let's talk tomorrow," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. Her warmth chased away the cold that clung to him, but the unease in her eyes lingered. As Nora led him out of the room, Wick glanced back. The window was closed, and the desk was bare. Yet, as he stepped into the hallway, the air behind him seemed to hum faintly, as if the crow's presence still lingered, folded tightly into the corners of the room. The next morning, Wick overheard his parents talking about the neighbor's dog, but he hadn't come home. The only thing they'd found was his collar, lying in the grass, torn and charred. Wick didn't say anything, but the pit in his stomach grew heavier. That day at school, he sat alone, clutching his notebook tightly. The whispers lingered in his mind, faint but unshakable, like a distant melody he couldn't forget. The days following the crow's arrival bled together in a haze of unease for Wick. The nightly visits continued, their rhythm as inevitable as the setting sun. Each evening, the paper crow would appear, tapping insistently on the window until Wick let it in. Its riddles, spoken in that strange, melodic tongue, began to dominate his thoughts. At first, he mimicked the sounds hesitantly, his voice trembling with fear and fascination. But the more he spoke, the more fluent he became, the words spilling out like long-forgotten memories. The first sign of real consequences came on an otherwise ordinary morning. At school, during recess, Wick was sitting on the edge of the playground, scribbling in his notebook. The symbols he drew were sharper now, their patterns more intricate. He didn't understand their meanings, but his hand seemed to know what to do. His classmates, running and shouting in the distance, faded into white noise. A scream tore through the air, shattering his focus. Wick snapped his head up to see Matthew, the boy from next door, lying sprawled in the dirt, his body convulsing. A crowd of children gathered, their voices blending into a cacophony of panic. Wick pushed himself to his feet, but something held him back. He watched as Matthew's lips moved, murmuring words that Wick recognized immediately. It was the crow's language, the alien syllables spilling from Matthew's mouth like poison. Teachers rushed to Matthew's side, calling for an ambulance. By the time help arrived, the boy had stopped convulsing. His eyes fluttered open, wide with terror. He screamed until his throat gave out, his voice raw and broken. When the paramedics asked him what had happened, Matthew only shook his head, unable to explain. At home, Wick's drawings took a darker turn. His notebook, once filled with whimsical landscapes and animals, now bore disturbing images. He sketched buildings crumbling into voids, their edges dissolving into ash. Faces he recognized, classmates, neighbors, even his parents, were depicted in grotesque detail, their features twisted and decayed. He didn't remember drawing most of them, but the images were undeniably his. It wasn't long before the events in his notebook began bleeding into reality. The first incident was subtle. A small fire broke out in the school's art room, destroying the corner where Matthew's desk sat. Then, a family on their street awoke to find their garden inexplicably withered overnight, the plants reduced to blackened husks. The morning after Wick drew his father's silhouette breaking apart, Bram tripped down the stairs, fracturing his wrist. Nora noticed the changes in her son. His cheerful, chatty demeanor had given way to a quiet intensity. He spent hours hunched over his notebook, whispering under his breath. When she asked him what he was drawing, he would snap the book shut and mutter something about just practicing. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, now seemed shadowed and distant. One evening, while tidying his room, Nora found something tucked beneath his mattress. It was another notebook, this one different from the ones she'd bought him. Its cover was worn and stained, the pages filled with incomprehensible writing. The symbols Wick had been drawing were there too, interspersed with crude sketches of the crow. Nora's hand trembled as she flipped through the pages. The air around her felt charged, as though the book itself were alive. The paper was unnaturally warm, and when she tried to rip out a page, the edges burned her fingers. She dropped the notebook with a gasp, backing away from it as though it might leap at her. "Wick," she called, her voice shaking. He appeared in the doorway, his expression guarded. "What's wrong?" "What is this?" Nora demanded, pointing at the notebook. Wick glanced at it and shrugged. "It's just drawings." "These are not just drawings," she snapped, her voice cracking. This isn't normal. Where did you learn this?" The boy said nothing. He only stared at her, his silence more unnerving than any argument he could have made. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving Nora standing alone in the room, her heart pounding. Tension in the house escalated. Bram, already frustrated with Wick's withdrawn behavior, began to blame Nora for indulging him. Their arguments grew louder, the words sharper. Nora insisted something was wrong with their son, but Bram dismissed her fears as overreactions. "It's just a phase," he said one night, slamming his fist on the kitchen table. "He's a kid, Nora. He'll grow out of it." "This isn't normal, Bram," Nora shot back. "He's not just acting out. Something is happening to him." Their voices carried through the house, loud enough for Wick to hear from his room. He sat on his bed, his knees drawn to his chest, while the paper crow perched on his desk. It was there even in the daylight now, its presence more tangible. It watched him with an intensity that felt almost predatory, its folded wings twitching with anticipation. That night, the crow issued a new challenge. Its voice was louder, more insistent, filling the room with its dry, melodic tones. Wick hesitated. This riddle was harder, the words twisting in his mind like barbed wire. He didn't understand the question, but he felt compelled to answer. The air around him grew heavy, the shadows in the room deepening. "What do you want from me?" Wick whispered, his voice trembling. The crow tilted its head and spoke a single word, its tone sharp and final. Wick repeated it instinctively, the sound rolling off his tongue like a spell. The power in the house cut out instantly. The light bulbs popped, plunging the family into darkness. Nora and Bram's voices rose in alarm from downstairs. Wick barely heard them. His focus was locked on the crow, which spread its folded wings and let out a screech that seemed to pierce his very soul. The door burst open, and Nora rushed in, her face pale with fear. "Wick, what's happening?" He didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his body rigid. Nora followed his gaze, and her breath caught. The crow was perched on the sill, its form unraveling into a whirlwind of ash. The room filled with the sound of rustling paper as the ash reformed into the bird, its edges sharper than before. "Stay away from him," Nora shouted, grabbing her son and pulling him back. The crow's head snapped toward her, and it let out another piercing screech before taking flight, disappearing into the night. The room fell silent, but the tension lingered, a heavy weight pressing against the walls. Nora held Wick tightly, her hands trembling. "It's gone," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The silence of the house was unbearable. Nora paced the hallway outside Wick's room, clutching the edges of her robe as though it might hold her together. The events of the night had shaken her, and though the crow had disappeared, she couldn't escape the feeling that its presence still clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. When she checked on Wick the next morning, he was sitting on his bed, staring at his desk. His notebook lay open, its pages filled with symbols she couldn't comprehend. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling. "It's not gone." Nora knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his pale face. "What do you mean?" "It's still here," he whispered, pointing to the window. Outside, the birch trees swayed gently in the breeze, but Nora saw no sign of the crow. Still, she felt its shadow, a promise of its inevitable return. That evening, the house felt heavier, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of something unseen. Nora's gaze fell on the notebook sitting on the counter. She had found it again earlier that day, tucked in the back of Wick's closet beneath a pile of old toys. It looked worse than before, the cover fraying, its pages warped and stained. She hadn't dared to open it this time. She could still feel the faint heat radiating from it, a pulsing reminder of its unnatural power. It has to stop, she thought, gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stood abruptly, grabbing the notebook and marching toward the backyard. Nora stepped into the cool night air, her breath fogging in the dim glow of the porch light. The backyard stretched out before her, empty and silent, save for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. She clutched the notebook tightly, its faint heat seeping through her fingers as though it were alive. Standing in the center of the yard, she fumbled with a box of matches, her hands trembling. She struck one, the tiny flame flickering in the breeze. The notebook's pages seemed to quiver, the heat intensifying as she held the match closer. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The flame touched the edge of the cover, and for a brief moment, the fire roared to life, consuming the frayed pages with a ferocity that startled her. But just as quickly, the blaze faltered. The flames curled inward, twisting unnaturally until the fire was smothered entirely. The notebook remained unscathed, its edges smooth and unmarred, as if the attempt had never happened. "No," Nora whispered, stumbling back. Her heart pounded as she dropped the book onto the grass, its heat lingering on her skin. The air around her grew colder, heavy with an unseen weight. The shadows cast by the porch light stretched unnaturally, creeping toward her like grasping fingers. The notebook's cover flared faintly, the symbols on its surface glowing for the briefest of moments before fading back into stillness. Nora didn't wait to see what came next. She turned and ran inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breath. Upstairs, Wick's door creaked open. His voice drifted down the stairs, soft and trembling. "Mom, it's here." Inside, Wick sat on his bed, his hands folded in his lap. The paper crow perched on his desk, its head cocked as it whispered in its jagged, melodic tongue. Wick didn't respond. He was beyond fear now, his body numb to everything but the weight of the crow's presence. Nora burst into the room, her face pale and frantic. "Wick, we have to stop this," she cried, her voice trembling. The boy didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the crow, whose whispers grew louder, more insistent. Nora's eyes darted to the desk, where a fresh symbol had been etched into the wood. It pulsed faintly, its lines glowing with a sickly light. "No!" she shouted, grabbing the crow and flinging it against the wall. It crumpled on impact, its paper body folding into a heap on the floor. But even as it lay there, it began to reform, its sharp edges twisting back into shape. "Wick, listen to me." Nora grabbed her son by the shoulders, shaking him. "You have to fight it. You can't let it control you." "I can't stop," Wick whispered, his voice hollow. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he finally looked at her. "If I stop, it'll take you." The crow cawed loudly, its voice like tearing metal. The lights in the room flickered and popped, plunging them into darkness. Shadows poured from the corners, swirling around them like a living storm. Nora tightened her grip on Wick, pulling him close as the air grew colder. Her gaze fell on the notebook lying on the desk. The heat from it seemed to radiate through the darkness, the glow of its symbols casting faint patterns on the walls. She released Wick and lunged for it, grabbing the book with both hands. The moment she touched it, the crow shrieked. The shadows surged, slamming into her like a wave, but she held tight, her fingers digging into the warped leather cover. "You won't have him," she screamed, her voice raw. She tore at the book, the pages resisting her efforts like steel. The air crackled around her, the crow's voice rising to a deafening crescendo. With a final, desperate scream, she ripped the book in half. The house erupted into chaos. The crow exploded into countless paper shards, each one slicing through the air like shrapnel. They swirled around Nora and Wick, their movement chaotic and violent. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. When Nora opened her eyes, the house was silent. She blinked, her vision hazy, her body aching as if she'd been crushed beneath an invisible weight. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her breath hitching in her throat. "Wick?" she called, her voice hoarse. There was no response. The room was empty. His bed was neatly made, his toys arranged perfectly on the shelves. There was no sign he had ever been there. Nora stumbled into the hallway, her heart racing. "Wick!" she shouted, running from room to room, but the house was empty. His photos, his drawings, even the crumpled papers he always left scattered. Everything was gone. She collapsed onto the floor, her head in her hands. "No, she whispered, her voice breaking. No, no, no. Her gaze lifted to the windowsill. Sitting there was a single folded paper crow, its lifeless form staring back at her. The days that followed blurred together. Nora moved through the world like a ghost, searching for answers she knew she wouldn't find. She visited libraries, consulted occultists, even sat through sermons in unfamiliar churches. But no one could explain what had happened to her son, or why she was haunted by the faint sound of whispers that followed her everywhere. At night, she sat by the window, staring at the paper crow she couldn't bring herself to throw away. It sat there unmoving, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. One evening, as the wind howled outside, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. Across the street, in the window of a darkened house, she saw it. Another paper crow. It perched on a windowsill, its sharp silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a child's lamp. Nora's stomach turned as the whispers began again, faint and melodic, carried on the wind. The cycle had begun anew, and this time she could do nothing to stop it.